All right, welcome to our video walkthrough of A Novel of Your Own, Part 2, Chapter 11 of her book, as we march toward the end of Jane Smiley's text. So this will be a relatively quick video for a couple of reasons, and I'm actually going to explain why, because of something she says near the very beginning of this chapter, that there is no technical solution to the problems of the novel. And that your job is to bring knowledge, taste, judgment, and strategy to all the aspects you are capable of considering. And so, what this made me think of, her statement about there being no technical solution to the problems of the novel, it makes me think about the myriad, blessedly large pool of choices that we as writers have when it comes to bastions of advice. And what I mean by that is I think about the exceptionally large body of work that exists, similar to this chapter, that thinks about the structure of novels, tools for revising and completing them, and the fact that there are so many because there is not one way to do that. And that is both a blessing and a curse, in that there are so many ways of thinking about how to approach revising and completing a novel. In that the good thing is that when one approach doesn't align with or speak to you, you can go on to another one. But the downside is that there are so many ways to do this that if you're the type that is more sort of give me the one way to do this to be successful, that just doesn't exist, right? There's not one piece of golden advice that if you hear it, you will suddenly be able to do whatever it is that you want to do. And that can be very frustrating on many fronts. And so, what I like to tell people is that the goal is not to seek out this ideal single technical solution, to use Smiley's words, so much as to read widely, to encounter as many different bits of advice or habits of writing and revising as you can, and to be open to trying a whole host of different things until you find the thing or things that will resonate with you, that work well with you, that yield the kinds of results that you want. I think the best writers and students of writing are not necessarily the ones that have some inborn ability inherently or who discover right away what to do and just keep doing it forever, but the ones that are flexible and are willing to try a variety of things. So, just to provide a quick overview of some of the things that she talks about. These terms are probably not new to you, but the four pieces she talks of here, she thinks of novels in four parts: exposition, rising action, climax, denouement. And many of you probably are familiar with the Freytag triangle, even if you're not familiar with that term. It's that shape that everybody in high school had to look at with, the starting line for exposition, the rising action leading to a climax, then the falling action and the resolution. She kind of combines two of those. And I'm not going to go into massive detail about each of these because I don't think she's necessarily saying anything particularly new in describing that structure. But I do think she has some interesting things, as always, to say in several of those points. But one thing that she does say early on, is what she means by this idea of suspense. And I think this is really sensible of her and a really great way of thinking about the propulsion of your novel. And that is that the suspense that makes novels work is that of finding out what really happened, not what the real outcome of a particular dramatic event was, but what its real cause was. And that you don't have to provide spectacle. So suspense doesn't have to mean big, loud things. But we want to understand how we get from one place to another. And so just a couple of things sort of related there too, when we talk about the exposition, that it's the place in your novel where you show who the protagonist is, who the antagonist is, and what their conflict seems to be. And it's worth mentioning that the protagonist is always, the term she uses, a consciousness, usually human, but sometimes not, as any number of fantasy novels reveal. But the antagonist might not be. And this is that, you probably, again, tapping into some pretty universal lessons and ideas about writing. There's this notion of person versus self, or person versus their environment, or person versus the world. Person versus person is just one of the ways that the antagonist is a human being or a consciousness, whereas it doesn't have to be. And then another, she talks about some of the different ways that novels open, right? David Lodge's How Far Can You Go is fairly traditional. We're literally kind of getting a portrait of everybody, whereas other novels might have start your characters moving and talking as if you were entering their lives suddenly, right in the middle of things. I will say that has kind of become a much more popular 21st century way of doing things, dropping readers right into the heart of events. As they're unfolding, making that exposition actually much, much shorter and leading us off with pretty much jumping very quickly to rising action and having us discover things about the protagonist and the antagonist as that goes on. And then just a couple things she says about the rising action. I don't actually have slides for the climax of the denouement because I think what she has to say about that speaks for itself. But think of rising action as generally your meat of the novel. And I love the way that she describes this, that this is where something that seems implausible at the time of the exposition, the climax, is actually being prepared for. That the writer is working through that suspension of disbelief to the point where something is transformed or very different when we get to the climax. She talks about Isabella Archer and how if we knew what happens at the climax at the beginning, we initially wouldn't believe it based on what we learn about her from the very get-go. And so what's happening is that the situation, hopefully made interesting enough for us as readers, is creating that suspension of disbelief. So we are happy to follow our protagonist into what might at the outset feel like an implausible situation or choice. And so thinking about that, and I think that this speaks to what she says about details, that each detail that we give is an insertion into our reader's inner life. And how that is a really useful way of thinking about the choices that we make when we are deciding what goes into our books and our stories. And so how are we are in some ways invading, so to speak, our readers' lives with these details. So why are we giving them X, Y, or Z details? And then just a couple of larger things she talks about, starting on page 241, this idea of breadth and depth, that each novelists who want both breadth and depth are constrained by the form of the novel, that it's very hard to do both. Some readers are happy to give up depth for pattern and breadth, for the sparkle of the author's vision, wit, and intelligence. Others will tar you with Dickensian brush. And just thinking about like this idea of how do we write something that is both broad and deep, and that's very difficult to do. Okay, and just toward the end here, just the last three things I want to look at. She says a couple of really interesting things about revising and rewriting. And I am very much with her on this. Attempt to do your first rewrite as you did your rough draft as continuously as possible and without consulting anyone. This is a weirdly freeing thing, in that when you know you're not going to have anyone looking at, and obviously in our class we are looking at material, so this is more of a do as I say, not as I do. If you just write your junky rough draft and know you're going to revise it at least once without anyone really looking at it, there's something very freeing about that. Because you can experiment and do what you can. But the key is just to fix all the best you can. As she says, working through it until you are fairly satisfied, not only with the effort you've made, but with the product you come up with. And then take a long break. I think that this idea of giving yourself time and space between drafts is actually quite important. When I was a young writer, I wondered, like, if someone was a professional writer and that was most of their life, what's taking so long, right? Why haven't they written, their book faster? And then I learned from my own process how silly I was being, but also the importance of time between and giving yourself a break and allowing the work to kind of breathe and exist on its own before you go into that next major draft. And I have written failed novel drafts not taking Jane Smiley's advice, by deciding, okay, if I just keep rewriting and rewriting and rewriting this, I'll figure it out. But I wasn't making a plan. I wasn't thinking through the choices I was making, didn't have a clear sense of what I wanted the work to be. And I think that's totally fine when you're writing that first draft, and even when you're writing that first rewrite. But at some point, you want to really be thinking through and deciding what it is that I want and how am I going to get there in this next two drafts so that I don't have to keep writing and flailing without a plan. So you may or may not agree with her. And this is just one person's sense of how to do things. And she's certainly not saying, I don't think, that if you do this, you'll get a perfect novel. Well, one, she doesn't think the perfect novel exists. But two, it may or may not work every time. And you don't have to agree with her. And you can have your own processes. But I think it is worth thinking about and experimenting when you can with the ideas and processes that she is promoting here. So worth thinking about. I'll be curious to see what you have to say about her suggestions and ideas in our chat.